The Roman Empire was an imperial juggernaut that prioritized military conquest and exhausted natural resources in the course of expansion. The canon of imperial Roman ideology, altogether called Humanitas, rested on the idea of Roman cultural, political, and militaristic superiority. Obviously, this being public ideology went directly towards furthering Rome's imperial project. The more that Roman ideology spread, the more the Roman Empire would be able to expand. Ubiquitously Roman values such as strength, loyalty, and organization that were the building blocks of Romanitas made their way into the public imagination so as to be reflected in the forms of art, literature, philosophy, agriculture, and science of the time. Seemingly objective accounts of the natural environment were not exempt from being influenced by the political narrative of Roman excellence. Two of Rome's most famous authors, Virgil and Pliny the Elder, who both lived during the peak of Roman imperial ideological dissemination in the early stages of the burgeoning empire, both depicted the natural world in ways which reflected Roman political thought at the time. In the works of these authors, the behavior of animals can often be seen to reflect Roman values such as military strength, hierarchical social structures, and vast political organization. Individuals high up in power, such as Emperor Augustus, benefited politically and monetarily from the widespread dissemination of these works that subliminally championed specific modes of Roman belief, being imbued with imperialist ideology and the glorification of military might. This video will explore the writings of Pliny and Virgil and examine the depictions of the ubiquitously Roman political sentiments that these authors embedded within their interpretations of the natural world. In my analysis, I hope to elucidate the strength of political influence on the earliest of supposedly encyclopedic texts. In order to start, I'm going to take you way back to the beginning, to the founding of Rome. Rome was founded in around 1000 BCE. The Romans told themselves three basic founding myths to explain the birth of their empire. These three myths include the myths of Romulus and Remus, two brothers who fought one another in order to lay claim to the civilization that would eventually become Rome, the myth of Evander and Hercules, and the myth that will be the most significant for this video, the story of Aeneas. But we will get back to that in a second. Okay, so what do you need to know? You need to know about the Roman Civil War. Basically, up until about the turn of the millennium, Rome was a republic. It was called the Roman Republic. I think we're all pretty familiar with this name, just as much as we're familiar with the term Roman Empire. But what was the difference between Rome as a republic and Rome as an empire? I mean, many, but I think the most significant was the turn towards imperial conquest in Roman political ideology. Up until the reformation of Rome as an empire, Rome operated mostly on the principles of democracy that had been developed by the ancient Greeks. It was only around the Roman Civil War that Rome developed the image of militaristic might that we still associate with it today. This is not to say that the Roman Republic wasn't expansive. In fact, during the height of the Republic was the period of the greatest expansion in Roman history. This is just to say that the characteristic that internally defined Roman political structure and the Roman self-image of political thought was not yet quite imperialism. This is in the sense that the Roman Republic was not yet an empire and was not yet being led by a single authoritarian imperial ruler. The Republic was internally comprised of senates, magistrates, and popular assemblies of the people. In this sense, the people had much more power, and loyalty to Rome meant something much more different than what it became, which was an unwavering devotion to the narrative of the excellence of the Roman state, a love for the empire and the emperor. So what happened in the Roman Civil War? How did it start? Basically, it was kicked off by the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE. Caesar had been the last great leader of the Roman Republic, and many associated him with the glory days of the Roman civilization. In the following years after Caesar's death, there was a power vacuum left by his absence. What ensued was an internal war between two different factions within the Roman oligarchy that split in order to seize power following the end of Caesar's rule. It came down to Marcus Antonius, versus the man who would eventually become the first emperor of Rome. This was Julius Caesar's adopted son, Octavius, also known by the names of Julius Caesar Octavianus, Octavian, or Augustus. Emperor Augustus won the series of conflicts with Marcus Antonius and reorganized the Roman civilization into the Roman Empire. Now, I think an important question to ask would be, how did the Roman people feel about all of this? Well, they did not like it. It was war. Therefore, Augustus, among his many first tasks as the new emperor, found that one of his primary goals would have to be winning over the support of the people. Now, this is where Virgil comes in, one of the two authors that I want to talk about today. This is also where we get back to that third Roman founding myth, the myth of Aeneas, his flee with the Trojans after the legendary sacking of Troy, his subsequent wanderings around the Mediterranean, and his eventual founding of Rome. This myth was canonized by Virgil in the form of the Aeneid, one of the most famous works of ancient Rome and one of the most influential Latin texts of all time. But again, before we get into the Aeneid too much, let me talk a little bit more about Virgil. And let me just say real quick before we get too deep into the background of Virgil and my explanation of the Aeneid and what it meant in the context which I already described, the aftermath of the Roman civil wars, the reformation of the empire, and the instatement of Emperor Augustus as the first emperor of Rome, I want to iterate what I think this explanation means towards explaining my thesis as a whole. Virgil was an influential poet, yes, and the Aeneid was an influential text, yeah, and yes, all of this historical context is important and interesting, but why is it necessary? Well, I think there needs to be some explanation of the development of Roman ideology before we start getting into trying to identify it in these texts. Also, it is worth noting that these texts that we are getting into exist, as a matter of course, within the context of a larger written canon of these two authors, and within the context of all of this historical content as a whole. This means that understanding these contexts, understanding these authors, and understanding the development of Rome will be crucial in understanding the underlying meaning of the depictions of the natural world and animal behavior in these texts when we eventually get there. And trust me, understanding the content and message of the Aeneid will be tantamount in understanding what is going on when we eventually get to analysis of Virgil's later text, the Georgics. Okay, so who was Virgil? Virgil was a poet who lived during this time frame when Augustus took power and began his rule of the newly formed Roman Empire. Virgil was also a member of the upper class, a member of the group of elite intellectuals who, despite existing in a different occupational realm than the politicians at the time, would nevertheless intersect and intermingle with the political goings-on by way of their upper class status. Therefore, Virgil was favored by Augustus, who loved his work so much that he published Virgil's unfinished manuscript of the Aeneid against Virgil's dying wishes after he died. Virgil only wanted it kept from being published because it was unfinished, and for most contemporary scholars' assessment, still in a drafting phase. However, the potential Augustus saw in this work was enormous. Let me remind you again of what would be Augustus's main job following the Roman Civil War, gaining the support of the people. The Aeneid, in the form of the founding myth of Rome that had to do with Aeneas, provided Augustus with the perfect way of disseminating these new Roman ideas, which would altogether come to solidify his rule. The Aeneid tells the story of Aeneas, a character lifted by Virgil from Homer's The Iliad, which tells the story of the Trojan Wars in which Aeneas fought. In the Iliad, Aeneas is a relatively minor character, a soldier on the side of the Trojans. In the Iliad, Virgil tells his story, beginning right at the end of the events of the Iliad with the sacking of Troy and the victory of the Greeks over the Trojans. Here, at the beginning of the Aeneid, Aeneas is forced to flee from the falling city of Troy with a group of his Trojan men and venture out into the Mediterranean Sea in search of their new home. However, for Aeneas, the idea of finding a new land to call his own is not some abstract desire he holds. Instead, he is guided by a concrete prophecy that had been divinely given to him before the opening of the text, which said that he would be destined to found the greatest civilization of all time. Therefore, his and his men's search throughout the Mediterranean is not aimless. It is in search of the place where will be the founding of Rome. At about the midpoint of the text, Aeneas finds himself in the underworld and has a conversation with his deceased father. Up until this point in the text, although Aeneas knows and has been guided by the idea that he will go on to found Rome, this ideal and magnificent future civilization, he is yet to understand exactly what shape that nation will take or what character it will have. In the underworld, his father gives shape to what will become Rome, in order for Ennius to have a further understanding of what he will go on to found. He says to Ennius, "Others, I have no doubt, will more softly hammer out the breathing bronze, or draw out the living face from marble. They will plead cases better, and trace out with a rod the path of the heavens, and predict the rising of the stars. You, Roman, remember to rule the people of the earth by your command. These will be your arts. Impose the ways of peace, spare the subjected, and battle down the proud." Here we have one of the most fundamental and concise articulations of Roman imperial ideology, the foundation for the ideals of the ubiquitous Humanitas. In this passage, Ennius's father articulates to Ennius how the future art of Rome will be the art of imperialism and the art of military conquest. Here, in this text, Virgil is laying the groundwork for the Roman imperial ideology of the excellence of expansion, the moral right of Rome to subjugate the weak and to be the unquestionable imperial ruler of the Mediterranean, the divinely ordained ruler of the world. Here, the virtue of the maintenance of peace is shown to be through the rule of authority. There is the moralized element of the need to battle down the proud, therefore putting those in their place who are too proud to rule, which is in contrast to the Roman ruling methodology, which, as strict and as totalitarian as it may be, is always with a sense of humility and piety, being that there is a loyalty to the nation state, a loyalty to Rome, rather than a internal desire or greed to rule. This ideology is perfect for being internalized by the masses. This makes it so that every Roman citizen can become a direct contributor to the idealistic vision of Rome. By simply being a common citizen of Rome and being loyal to the Roman nation imperial state, you are promoting the values of peace and doing your part within the social hierarchy in which you belong. The Romans are not greedy or evil rulers. The Romans are doing this to help others. And to be a part of that universal and universalizing and peaceful empire would have to be the greatest privilege a man could dream of. But this empire must still be won by military might. And the Romans are the ones who are the most adept at that. And because of this, must bear the responsibility of being the subjugators of the rest of the world. Anyway, Ennius eventually lands in Italy, meets up with the people there, the Latins, and kills all of them who gets in his way of laying claim to their land in the statement of his authority over them as a people. This is characterized by the text as very just. The Latins initially receive Ennius welcomingly, and the king actually wants him to be wed to his daughter, which makes it in the text so that Ennius does not only have a divine right to rule over this people, but the people want them to rule over them themselves. And now he is legally a part of their monarchy and has become the rightful descendant and heir to the throne. The text only makes it so that it is the less civilized and more oriental band of Latins who take issue with this, and the leader of which directly instigates conflict with Ennius, and out of his own personal greed, jealousy, and lust for power. Ennius isn't doing anything wrong after all. He's got a right to lead. It's the Roman art. And it would be the thing to do to make these people happy. In the end, Ennius manages to clear his way of potential obstacles to the concretization of his power, and he founds Rome, defeating the leader of the combative Latin sect in a very violent way, which some scholars actually believe was Virgil offering a subtle critique of the base negative effects of militaristic expansion and imperialism, that being a never-ending cycle of bloodshed. Nevertheless, Augustus chose to insert this text very deliberately into public consciousness, and it became a leading text and popularly accepted origin story of Rome. In many ways, Ennius was a spiritual embodiment of Augustus, being a sheer force of political and imperial brilliance, one-minded in his quest to lead the Roman people. The Aeneid also canonized Ennius as a direct blood ancestor of the Caesar lineage, which Augustus was at the bottom of. Having the founder of Rome's blood flowing through his veins, gave him an even greater leg to stand on in the eyes of the Roman people. But principally, this text glorified imperial conquest, and it instated the new values of the Roman Empire: military strength in the face of all odds that would get in the way of your unwavering, unmitigated loyalty to the national identity and your nationalistic endeavors. Before I go on to talk some more about Virgil and Pliny specifically, I want to take a moment to briefly examine the general ways in which the ancient Greeks and Romans understood the natural world and their relationship with the natural world. When we move on to Virgil and Pliny, eventually, what we are going to see and what I'm going to direct your attention to is the method of projection and anthropomorphization, personification, essentially, of the natural world in order to fit a human narrative. This is all to say that up until when Virgil and Pliny produced their work, there had already been established within the Greco-Roman canon a tendency to anthropomorphize the natural world and to project onto it human experiences, desires, phenomenons, sensations, etc. For many ancient Greek and Roman thinkers and writers, the natural world was the other. It was the set of all phenomenon that was not human. And in order to more effectively be able to exist in the world accompanied and occupied by such a vast and breathtakingly sublime other, anthropomorphizing the natural world and imbuing it with a humanness was effective in understanding it and in creating a relationship with it. But similarly to how we will see in Virgil and Pliny, with their use of the natural world in order to more clearly elucidate specifically Roman concepts and specifically Roman concepts that go all together towards furthering the Roman imperial project, the natural world in ancient Greek and Roman texts would often also be used in its anthropomorphic qualities that were bestowed onto it by the human actors in order to further human desires.
Following is a passage taken from the Works and Days by Hesiod, in which I think you can see the dynamic that I am getting to.
When Orion and Sirius come into mid-heaven, Perses, and rose-fingered Dawn meets Arcturus, then set about cutting off all the grape clusters for home, expose them to the sun for 10 days and 10 nights, cover them over for 5, and on the 6th day draw Mary Dionysus' gift off into jars. But when the Pleiades and Hyades and mighty Orion are setting, then be thinking of plowing in its season, and may the seed lodge firmly in the earth.
In the same breath, the ancient Greeks and Romans are able to personify the natural world, but also see it as a resource to be extracted. The result of this is that there is extreme care given to when these resources are taken from the natural world. There's a reverence applied to the natural world at the same time as it is seen as the other and as an other that is less than humanity and that is ripe to be used as a resource by humanity in order to further human desires. This is something that we will be able to see when we get to the works of Virgil and Pliny, because they are able to articulate how the animals that they describe are reverent, intelligent, anthropomorphic, but at the same time only deriving their worth from their anthropomorphic qualities that line up with the political ideology of the time. The last point that I want to make before we actually move on to Virgil and Pliny is the idea of the almanac, the farmer's almanac, the breadth of writing that is not strictly prose or poetry, but bills itself as scientific or agricultural, informative, objective documents or accounts. This is what the Georgics can be seen as well as Pliny's Natural History, which is presenting itself as the first kind of encyclopedic account of the natural world. I want to bring this up because this is not something that is new. This is something that you can kind of see in Hesiod's works and days and in other bodies of work written by the ancient peoples. It was not all epics. It was not all poetry or prose accounts of the natural world. The methods of projection and the observations of the natural world that were anthropomorphized and were doctored to fit the human narrative were not only poetic, or it was not only metaphorical. This is something that you can see in direct, seemingly objective, strict accounts of the natural world. I want to take you back to Hesiod with the Works and Days, the text that I think very similarly resembles the Georgics in that it is presenting itself as a set of values to be lived by if you want to be a successful agriculturist. Now, obviously, this is not exactly similar to the Georgics, because in the Georgics, you have an actual animal being described in an anthropomorphic way, same as in the natural history. But what I think is significant here, and that will go on to inform our reading of the Georgics, is the fact that, same as in the Works and Days and same as in the Georgics, what you are seeing is an account of the natural world that is very, very much skewed and interpreted in order to fit a human bias. In the Works and Days, this is a moralized account of the natural world. This is what is seemingly a very specific set of rules and based on scientific objective observations. But if you look a little bit deeper, you can see how this is a biased interpretation. It is a moralized account. This is something that is across much of Greek and Roman literature and agricultural and political documents, in the sense that the natural world is being used in order to determine the best way to live a life as a human on the planet. That last sentence that I just said is going to be crucial in understanding the Georgics and the natural history. Because in those, rather than saying this is how you should live your life, they are creating an animal, creating a character, basically, imbued with the values of how you should live your life. So what I'm getting at here through this section of the video is the sense that Virgil and Pliny are taking things that have been running, taking currents, they're tapping into something that has been going on for centuries up until their day, which is using the natural world in order to determine the best morally way of living a life. And then therefore, not actually taking it on its own terms, taking it as something, as a guidebook in order to understand how humanity should function. And the thing that I want to highlight there is that there is a cyclical relationship in that. You can either look at the natural world as something that holds the answers to how you should live, which is kind of what you can see in Hesiod, even though obviously that is still very much biased towards its perspective. But you can also already have an understanding of how you should live, how you should structure your people, how you should run your government, and then look into the natural world and find the things that match your narrative, and then present the way that you are living your life as a natural and moral thing because it exists in this elsewhere context, done in isolation from you by natural actors that would have done this thing on their own in a natural sense. Therefore, what you are doing is just as natural, just as automatic, and as that which exists would have just existed anyway, would have just come to be because it exists in a natural context. All right. Let's talk about bees. Who doesn't love bees? I'll tell you somebody who really loves bees. Virgil. The Georgics contains 4 chapters The final chapter of which is totally dedicated to understanding how a bee colony works. The last chapter of the Georgics that talks about bees is presented to us in the same way as the other three chapters of the Georgics, in that it is a intended farmer's almanac. It's a manual as to how to best and most properly upkeep your farm. This chapter is about how to keep bees and how to relate to the colony of bees as a human in order to better understand them, better maintain them, and, for the resources extraction of getting their honey. But the most interesting thing about this chapter is not the ways in which Virgil explains how the human being is supposed to have a relationship with the bees or the bees as an animal or the bee colony in general. It's the way that Virgil explains the inner workings of the bee colony. It's the way that Virgil explains the political and the social structures of the bee.
Virgil describes basically a perfect civilization, and not perfect in an objective sense, like we're looking at this text and we find it to be perfect ourselves, but Virgil pretty deliberately characterizes this civilization as functioning perfectly. The opening of this section reads as follows. Come now, and I'll impart the qualities Jupiter himself gave bees, for which reward they followed after the melodious sounds and clashing bronze of the Curetes, and fed heaven's king in the Dictaean cave. They alone hold children in common, on the roofs of their city as one, and pass their life under the might of the law. They alone know a country and a settled home, and in summer, remembering the winter to come, undergo labor, storing their gains for all. This society is delineated as having a very specific division of labor, where every single bee knows its place in the social system and is glad to perform it. The text talks about guard bees, worker bees, different types of bees at different ages, bees as wardens, all of which are coming together as a cohesive unit for the health of the beehive. Listen to how Virgil describes the bees' relationship with the leader of the bees, which in this case, Virgil characterizes as a king and not rightly as a queen. The leader is the guardian of their labors. To the leader they do reverence, and all sit round the leader in a noisy throng. The crowd round in large numbers, and often they lift the leader on their shoulders and expose their bodies in war, and among wounds seek a glorious death. I think that we can draw some pretty good parallels between the civilization and Rome, especially in how Virgil characterizes the ideal relationship with the leader being a guardian for the people of the stock. Listen to in this section how Virgil, still in the bees, talks about the virtues of military strength and the honorable element of violent conflict. Considering Virgil's relationship with Emperor Augustus, I feel like this kind of seems like a natural way that Virgil would paint the leader of the bee colony that he is kind of so clearly creating as a metaphorical utopia that Rome itself should achieve to. In other places in the text, Virgil describes how happy the bees are to continue their labor, that their labor is a burden to them, that the honey that they extract from flowers can sometimes be burdensome on their wings, but that they are happy to do so, that they are happy to carry this honey because it is the substance which will keep the colony alive. There's a organized sense of national unity. This bee colony, above everything else, can be characterized as nationalistic. That is the primary character trait being assigned to every bee. An undying loyalty, a piety, the same as what you see in Ennius in the founding myth of Rome, being so obsessed and so loyal to the Roman ideal, the idea of the Roman state. It's exactly what you can see in these bees as they exist in this context and carry out their tasks that are all so dedicated, so fixated on the good of the hive. And Virgil paints this as a very, very good and characteristic thing. This is how he ends this first section about the bees. Noting these tokens and examples, some have said that a share of divine intelligence is in bees, and a draught of ether, since there is a God in everything, earth, and the expansive sea and the sky's depths. From this source, the flocks and herds, men, and every species of creature, each derive their little life. At birth, to it surely all then return, and dissolved are remade, and there is no room for death, but still living, they fly to the ranks of the stars and climb the high heavens. In this sense, Virgil is giving them the same humanity, the same intelligence that humanity has. Now, this kind of gets back to what I was saying in the last section, where what's going on here is that Virgil is looking to the bees and saying the thing that drives these bees has to be the same spark of life that exists in humanity and in everywhere else. And this is coming right after painting a picture of a beehive that is guided primarily by individual sacrifice for the good of the whole. And the good of the whole as it advances a nationalistic and material conquest over nature. Now, what I talked about in the last section was how there's a tendency to read these texts as what's the best way to live. And I think that you can see this pretty plainly in this section. This is not just what's the best way to live as an individual, but it's also what's the best way to structure a society in general. And this is a perfect example of looking at a beehive, looking at Rome, and then justifying how Rome conducts its society, organizes itself, because there's already a natural precedent set within the beehive. Keep in mind that Virgil is not presenting these things that the bees are doing as fiction. This is not the most scientific account, like I mentioned earlier. Virgil says there's a king bee. There's no such thing as a king bee, but it's still being billed as a objective account of the natural world. This is not supposed to be a fable or a metaphor, an allegory. This is supposed to be taken literally. If this is supposed to be taken literally, then here we have the justification for the internal structure of Rome. Rome does not need to justify itself. Its justifications are external, already inherent to the natural world around it. And not only is Rome justifiable, but it's inherently honorable. It's inherently amazing and awesome and the best because it already exists in this natural system that is so efficient at what it does, the beehive, at making honey and at organizing itself. It's not just an excusable, okay way of running a society. It's Rome. It's the absolute best way of running a society. It's the only way. Because it's the only way, everybody else has got to join it too. This, again, is another thing. Making Rome so glorious like this, making a beehive, the perfect system that you can find in nature of a society, and making Rome this beehive, making it so glorious, this is just another thing that goes to furthering the imperial project. Rome is so amazing, it makes sense that it's expanding at the rate it is. It makes sense that Emperor Augustus is taking into his hands what we need as a people, what the world needs. We need to be like the bees.
I'm sorry I started that last section off so jovially. I will be much more serious about this one because elephants are no laughing matter. Okay, so who was Pliny the Elder? We've talked a lot about Virgil so far, but who exactly was Pliny the Elder, the author of the second work that we're going to look at today, the Natural History? Pliny the Elder was a writer in ancient Rome who was born and who died in the midst of the Roman Empire. It is important to note here that this is actually a difference from Virgil, who was born during the Roman Republic and witnessed the Republic's transition into an empire through the midst of the civil wars between Marcus Antonius and Octavius, who would eventually become Emperor Augustus. The key difference is that for Virgil, when Virgil wrote, and was imbuing his writings with imperialist ideology, this was ideology that he would have had to have learned in his lifetime. Obviously, it wasn't a night and day shift from the ideology of the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, but this was greatly exacerbated in Virgil's time. And as he was a contemporary of Emperor Augustus, who made sure to put these things into the public consciousness as much as possible, it can be surmised that Virgil was heavily influenced by the upsurge in the politics at the time, tending more towards imperialism. The interesting thing to note here is that Pliny the Elder always lived during a period of imperialist expansion while Rome was an empire. That meant that all of his beliefs were informed by the imperial political context. I think that this is a relevant difference in that what we're going to be looking at today, the work by Pliny the Elder, the natural history, is much more so than the Georgics, billed as a scientific observational text. And I say this because in the Georgics is written in the epic mode of writing, the poetic hexameter. The Georgics also contains a series of epic interludes. It does tell stories of Roman and Greek mythology. In that last chapter that we just looked at, chapter 4 of the Georgics, it ends with the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. That's totally unrelated to the bees, but it's in there. The natural history written by Pliny the Elder is a much more specifically neutral, sterilized, and encyclopedic text. Pliny, much more so than Virgil, was publicly known as a naturalist and a natural philosopher. He wrote the Encyclopedia Natural History to become a model for future encyclopedias and to be a collection, an amalgamation of the Roman knowledge at the time that would have been on the natural sciences, the ecological phenomenon, geographic phenomenon, and the just base observations of the natural world. The key difference here is that while both of them are presenting nature in an objective way and are shaping it with imperialist ideology, in this one, it's even more so meant to be taken as facts about these animals, the elephants that Pliny is writing on. Obviously, the natural history contains entries on all sorts of things, but I'm going to be talking about elephants today because in the natural histories section on elephants, which is quite a rather lengthy section, Pliny does get into a depiction of elephants that you can see heavily mirrors what Pliny and what other contemporary writers would understand as being natural virtues that are common among all species, specifically because these are the virtues that are practiced and are widespread, disseminated to such an extent as to adopt this veneer that they are a natural phenomenon within the Roman Empire.
Okay, I want to say real quick before moving on as well, something that I think I forgot to mention that I said I was going to mention earlier, which is why I think that it's relevant that Virgil witnessed the transition from the Republic to the Empire, whereas Pliny was born into the Empire and lived all of his life in the Empire. Why I think that is relevant, and kind of what I was getting to and what I just expressed, is the idea that Pliny would have a much more an implicit, the bias by which Pliny would write and the ideology, the subtlety of the ideology that would just naturally appear in his work is a little bit stronger than Virgil's because of Rome being in this imperial fashion for longer. So in the natural history, like the way I was explaining it as being, it's more of a natural objective account, that all of that going to say that because it's supposed to be a much more objective account, you can see these biases in there still subtly. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say. I don't know if I expressed that to the best of my ability, but just wanted to say that before I actually move on to talking about the elephants. All right.
The largest land animal is the elephant, and it is the nearest to man in intelligence. It understands the language of its country and obeys orders, remembers duties that it has been taught, is pleased by affection and by marks of honor. Nay, more, it possesses virtues rare even in man: honesty, wisdom, justice. Also, respect for the stars and reverence for the sun and moon. That passage is in the opening of this section on elephants. It is one of our first introductions to elephants. And in that passage, that contains much of what Pliny goes on to discuss about elephants in their intelligence, in their honorable virtues, their wisdom, their sense of justice. And also, what I want to bring an attention to this passage is seemingly the same reverence that the Roman people understand themselves as having for the natural system, they see as the elephants having for the natural system in the same way. Already in this opening statement, Pliny is making connections between humanity and elephants. He is equating them as members of the same species, although they are elephants. And I say this because in many of the other paragraphs on this section in elephants, Pliny specifically and deliberately characterizes the elephants as work animals, as subjugated creatures, less than humanity. Yes, they are intelligent. Yes, they have honor. They have wisdom. But obviously, there's a cap to that because they're an animal and because we have the ability to subjugate them. There's lengthy descriptions of elephants as they fight in human military, as they are used as a pack animal, as they are used in circuses, as they are used as symbols of honor or military might. These are all elephants as objects. So there's a still continued from the section that we looked at before in the works and days. In the second section of this video, there's the continued understanding that the elephant is an object, it's a part of the natural world, it's a part of the natural cycle, but we can see our soul and our spirit in it. It only happens that we are at the top of the hierarchy and we can subject them to our wills and our desires. However, the respect for the elephant goes very, very far. The elephant in this passage is termed to be very similar to humanity because not only does it kind of display the virtues of honesty, wisdom, and justice, similar to how with the bees, we get to see them displaying the virtues of loyalty and organization and unity to the nation state. The one thing that elephants also have is the same respect for the natural cycle that humans have, making them even closer to humanity. Now, I don't want to quote too much from this section because I have a very long quote coming up that I want to unpack. But I do want to explain how Pliny highlights the intelligence and the honor of the elephants. One detail that really sticks out to me when I read this section is the detail in which Pliny describes how elephants that are under the employment of humans, when they are tasked with disciplining another elephant, say one elephant is not eating, it's not getting in line, it's not, breaking to the hand of the human. Pliny describes how when that elephant is being put on the, disciplinary block, and the method of discipline is another human saying to another elephant, discipline this elephant, the elephant that has to do the disciplining will hesitate. And Pliny explains this with the elephants understanding the members of their species and being loyal to the higher metaphysical aspect of elephant, that the elephant is more loyal to the nation of elephant that exists in the upper realm of consciousness than it is to the orders that it has been given by humanity. Obviously, the hesitation doesn't go too far because they're an animal. So Pliny still makes it so that the elephants will fall in line, they will be subjugated. But this detail, and in other places as well, where Pliny depicts the elephants as working together, they are smart. They are able to understand when humans are around. They are able to intuit that a human hunter is a bad thing without ever even seeing one before. They travel in packs. They travel in straight lines. There's a camaraderie between them. All of these things that match up with the ideal Roman social structure. There needs to be a loyalty to Rome as an idea.
and that no Roman, the same as no elephant, is left behind, unless they are too weak to pull their lot, which is exactly something that Pliny here talks about as being an essential factor to elephants. Therefore, again, an essential fact of nature, again, with the values being put on honor, loyalty, and justice, and an obligation to your duty.
This next section I'm going to read in its entirety. It's very lengthy, but I would like you to hold in there with me because I think all of it is very important and very necessary. This is towards the end of this section of elephants. So far, Pliny has characterized elephants as honorable, wise, virtuous, and intelligent. But now, in this last section, Pliny begins to describe a battle scene between elephants and seemingly mythical
serpents of size that is, what he says, too big to actually exist in real life. So let's just dive in, bear with me, and then I would really want to unpack this after I finish reading it. But the biggest ones by India, as well as serpents that keep up a continual feud and warfare with them. The serpents also being of so large a size that they easily encircle the elephant in their coils and fetter them with a twisted knot. In this duel, both combatants die together, and the vanquished elephant, in falling, crushes with its weight the snake coiled around it. Every species of animal is marvelously cunning for its own interests, as are those which we are considering. One difficulty that the serpent has is in climbing to such a height. Consequently, it keeps watch on the track worn by the elephant going to pasture and drops on him from a lofty tree. The elephant knows that he is badly handicapped in fighting against the snake's coils, and therefore seeks to rub it against trees or rocks. The snakes are on their guard against this, and consequently begin by shackling the elephant's steps with their tail. The elephants untie the knots with their trunk, but the snakes poke their heads right into the elephant's nostrils, hindering their breathing and at the same time lacerating their tenderest parts. Also, when caught in the path of the elephants, they rear up against them, going specially for the eyes. This is how it comes about that elephants are frequently found blind and exhausted with hunger and wasting misery. What other cause could anybody adduce for such quarrels save nature arranging a match between a pair of combatants to provide herself with a show? Okay, so let's unpack this section. Now, I want you, before I even get into it, think of probably the most ubiquitous Roman art, sport, what have you, that you can think of. You might have thought of gladiatorial matches. This is exactly what this section is describing. This section is describing a almost scheduled, managed, and deliberately set up match between an elephant and a snake. It is a glorious battle. It is a violence that is embedded with a attention to detail that verges into the romantic. And the finishing statement of this section is that this is a natural match between a pair of righteous and equally set combatants for the entertainment and for the simply for the sake of the match. Now, the gladiatorial games were reflections of the Roman imperialist ideology. During the Roman Empire, the gladiatorial games were very specific ways for Rome to show off its military might and for the common people of Rome to revel in a practical, physical, live-action demonstration of the imperial and military might of Rome that they understand it to have. The gladiatory games were a way of disseminating imperialist ideology, same as literature, same as imperialism itself, into the eyes of the people. By characterizing the battle between the elephant and the snake as a natural part of nature, by essentially placing a gladiatory match within nature as a natural part of the system, the circle of life, this is a way of explaining the gladiatory matches of ancient Rome in the same natural terms. What this gets back to again is the idea that the way that Rome has structured its society is a naturally occurring mode of structuring society. It's the same mode of structuring a society that we see in nature between two animals with no human contact whatsoever. By extension of the gladiatory matches, imperialism becomes naturalized in exactly the same way. By saying that nature itself imbues the winner of this match and imbues the match itself with a sense of honor and virtue and worth, it is saying that the violent conflict that Rome engages in outside of its walls into other borders across the globe is the same thing. It's the same natural system. This, again, just like in the Georgics with the bees, is another way of explaining the ideology of a certain political system by turning to a natural system and finding it there. And in this case, because this is such a mythical battle, essentially fictionalizing an account that matches up one-to-one with what you are doing with your political structure.
This video is about the ancient Greek and Roman understanding of the natural world. So I figured that for my conclusion, it would be fitting for me to come outside and see what all the hubbub is about. The way that I want to conclude this video is by bringing your attention back to kind of what has been going on throughout each of these sections, in that a story is told in order to make the political activity of a certain regime seem more real in some way, more justifiable, more, in the case of the Aeneid, genetic, but in most of these stories, more natural than it actually is. By saying that you can find these things that Rome is doing in the natural world, by saying that these elephants, left to their own devices, will put on the same type of gladiatory matches that Rome does, by saying that the bee colony in all of its efficiency is the perfect civilization and the one that most accurately mirrors Rome. By saying all these things, Rome doesn't really have to change. I mean, we're all aware of the expansive power of Rome. What happened? Like, we all know that they went crazy and ate up most of the Mediterranean at their peak. We know that Rome was successful, and we know that the spread of Roman ideology was successful. There's still movies being made about it today. Everybody knows about Rome. Everybody knows about the people who lived there. And the main thing that we know is that they loved Rome. The Romans loved Rome. Everybody in Rome, they fought for Rome. The gladiators, everything. It's all about loyalty. So this ideological dissemination didn't fail. This was very, very effective in getting everybody on board for the imperial project that Rome began when it was conceived as a nation and perfected when it conglomerated into an empire. The reason I want to end this video by bringing us back to this idea, this principle, is because honestly, I think you can see this today way too often in many different cases. And I don't just mean in politics, but I mean the idea of taking a broken system, taking something that is fundamentally hurtful to other people, that exists on the basis of oppression, and justifying it on a natural basis. Groups throughout history have been oppressed in this same way by saying that it's a type of oppression that we're doing to you because it exists in nature and there's nothing that we can do to help that. We're just being human. It's humans being humans. But what that does is it strips humanity of any agency it actually has. Rome chose to structure its society in that way. There were people who benefited directly from society being structured in that way.
Emperor Augustus, for example, was one of the people who became more powerful because Rome was the way it was. The idea that Rome sprang up overnight on the same principles that we see everywhere else in the natural world is false. That is a lie. That's a fallacy that was created by the Romans. We choose the institutions that we have in place. We don't have them in place because they're natural. They're there because they're benefiting somebody. And just like in this, it's typically somebody in power who wants to keep it that way. Imperialism isn't a natural right. We don't find imperialism in nature. When you look at the natural world, it's not going to cleanly mirror whatever political structure is occurring in human society. Yes, there are similarities. We're animals, just like everything else. But what we decide to do and how we decide to structure our society is something that comes from our decision-making skills. It is not something that we just adopt by way of being human. It is not natural selection. We choose to live the way that we do. Imperialism doesn't work. It's a system that exists based upon the perpetuation of violence. Rome fell